Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Carl. The year is 5 ABY. The largest remaining Imperial fleet has been dealt a decisive blow at the Battle of Jakku. The wreckage of Imperial Superstar Destroyers still lay smoldering in the sands where they crashed. All across the galaxy, large pockets of Imperial Army and naval personnel were turning themselves into designated rebel checkpoints. The leader of the New Republic, Mon Mothma, had called for leniency for those Imperials who laid down their arms peacefully. Additionally, there was already a framework in place for the New Republic Amnesty program that was designed to rehabilitate these Imperials and introduce them to New Republic life.
Welcome to Amnesty Housing. It's paradise in comparison.
Most of the galaxy seemed tired of constant conflict, death, and economic instability, and Mon Mothma was more than eager to give them peace. But there were extreme voices on both sides of the conflict who were against a quick and forced peace. Rebels who had lost too many friends and had seen Imperial soldiers carry out unspeakable crimes.
You and your sword didn't see the light. You were captured.
No. I was liberated.
And then on the other side, you had the most fanatic individuals in the Empire who weren't necessarily upset that the New Republic won, but instead upset at their Imperial brethren who were surrendering without a fight.
A show of strength. They will rally behind us.
On several occasions, these fanatics would filter in with the rest of the POWs getting processed at New Republic checkpoints and detonate hidden suicide vests. Their goal was to punish the treachery of these Imperials, create fear and horror, but also to prolong the war as much as possible. And so who were these Imperials who carried out these acts of essentially terrorism that mimic the worst behavior of hardline rebel factions in the early years of the Galactic Civil War? Well, there were mostly small contingents of Stormtroopers. Squads, platoons, even individuals who had survived the larger battles who managed to filter out to the Outer Rim. Suddenly, small Imperial garrisons, which used to be an afterthought for the Empire, were now being flooded by some of the most battle-hardened and ideological members of the Stormtrooper Corp. And while some were organized by warlords or ISB officers, many just continued to fight on their own, completely independent from any kind of command structure. Like a terrorist organization or a criminal organization that has a decentralized command structure, so if the higher-ups do get wiped out, they can continue operating. It's kind of ironic how the Empire and the Rebels basically switch sides at the end of the war and mimic how the other side acted in the earlier stages of the conflict. And this Stormtrooper insurgency really caught Mon Mothma off guard. It ran counter to what her and her advisors believed would happen. They thought that by giving amnesty to Imperial soldiers and even junior officers that the war would come to a quicker end. They believed that once the logistical networks that supplied the Empire collapsed, that most troopers would just give up. The Chancellor had even written up plans to reduce the overall size of the New Republic forces by more than 90%, and had already began planning the training of local defense forces. She was perhaps a bit too optimistic, and she didn't understand the fanaticism of Emperor Palpatine's finest infantry units, the Stormtrooper Corp. For most of the early Galactic Empire's reign, it was the Imperial Army that secured the many frontiers of the galaxy. The Grey Boys, as I like to call them, were generally drawn from planetary defense forces and corporate sector forces that were rolled up into the Imperial Military soon after the collapse of the Galactic Republic. You know, Palpatine wanted a monopoly over violence as much as I want a monopoly over Ewok cheeks. But the Imperial Army was always just a stopgap measure to keep the galaxy stable until Palpatine could implement his radical political and cultural reform and create the ultimate totalitarian system. It was one thing to ask Imperial Army troopers to protect their home planets from pirates and bandits, something that they were more than willing to do in a lot of cases. It was an entirely different thing to ask them to carry out brutal oppression against civilians and oftentimes neighbors and fight a never-ending counterinsurgency against them. Eventually, morale would begin to collapse, and even the most hardened Imperial Army units would start to suffer defecation. Such was the case with the robbery of the Aldhani Depository, where rebels were aided by a disillusioned Imperial Army lieutenant. Now, Palpatine realized pretty early on that he needed a separate military force that wasn't just loyal to the state, but loyal personally to him and the new political order that he had created. Think Saddam Hussein's Republic Guard or Hitler's Waffen-SS? The clone army, in a lot of ways, was the perfect type of military force for this role, but they were prohibitively expensive, and also, the DNA from the original donor was basically gone.
Clone troopers will be needed to maintain order throughout the galaxy.
Indeed, a service conscription soldiers could provide at half the cost.
The skill level and efficiency of our clones is far superior to that of any recruited body.
Despite all of its neat gadgets and massive weapons, was always kind of a cheap organization. You needed to be cheap when you were talking about the type of quantity the Empire needed to control the galaxy. And bodies, well, bodies were cheap, especially after the destruction the Clone Wars had brought to the galaxy. There were thousands of impoverished worlds with their infrastructures and economies completely in shambles. He had tons of young men and women willing to do almost anything for a warm bed and a few square meals a day.
With the Empire, I get paid, I get fed, and I have a roof over my head. That's more than the Republic ever did for me.
These guys were known as the Elite Squad, basically the first variation of what would eventually be known as the Stormtrooper Corp. Following their first few deployment, the TK Trooper program would start, and conscripted and volunteer Imperial citizens would be trained by elite clone commandos. But even so, this first group of soldiers had some issues, especially with obeying orders, as we would find out. Will of Tarkin, the Emperor's own personal observer, was sent to oversee the first elite squad. They would be tasked with taking out a known group of partisans beneath the command of Saw Gerrera. Just like with the TIE fighter simulation we talked about in our last video, this wasn't just about completing a mission properly, but testing the soldiers' morals and ethics and seeing if they were willing to put them aside to obey orders.
We were promised transport off-world, that's all.
Then you're of no use to the Empire.
What are you doing? Guerrera's fighters are dead. These are civilians. We should bring them in. This is wrong.
So you're not going to comply?
No. None of us are. Ignore the clone. We signed up to be soldiers, not an execution squad. We're going to detain the prisoners and take them in for questioning.
Poor guy thought he was going to be just a regular soldier. He probably should have signed up for the Imperial Army Trooper program or the Naval Trooper program. You see, the Stormtrooper Corps was technically a part of the Imperial Army, but it had its own separate command structure, kind of like how the Marine Corps is a part of the Navy, but it has its own chain of command and also funding, lack of funding. The Stormtrooper Command reported to the Imperial High Command directly, but also at times was directly controlled by Emperor Palpatine and his main enforcer Darth Vader. The Stormtrooper Corps would basically become Palpatine's own personal army, and as such he wanted to make sure that they were created in a very different way from the other branches. First, Stormtroopers had to look the part. They had to be around 1.79 to 1.86 meters in height and weigh around 78 to 85 kilos. That's 5'9 to 6'1 in feet and 172 to 187 pounds. The reason why you had these restrictions were because, you don't want short troopers, no offense, short kings.
Too short for a stormtrooper?
Huh?
It's just not as intimidating, and also you don't want 7-foot Scandinavians in your military force either, because they would definitely stand out. Remember, the Stormtrooper armor wasn't just for protection. It was all about standardizing the look of your units, so you couldn't tell which one was which. It's kind of like Xerxes' Immortals, who didn't look like this at all, by the way. But, kill one of them and another carbon copy of that soldier climbs over that body and keeps pushing on your position. The endless nature of such a force, the unity, it's extremely intimidating. Also, with these helmets on, you couldn't really see the expression of the individual soldiers. You couldn't even really recognize them. And so civilians couldn't really plead or try to build relationships with individual soldiers. And instead of names, these troopers were given number designations, just like the TIE fighter pilots. Actually, things got so bad for the Stormtroopers that the ISB would actually monitor their comms throughout their entire mission to make sure that they wouldn't have any idle chatter while on patrol. These kind of things were frowned upon because nothing could really come in between a trooper and Emperor Palpatine, even your friends in your squad. As a matter of fact, these troopers from day one were conditioned to be very comfortable with sacrificing their brothers in arms for mission objectives. Even mission objectives that were completely pointless and just a test of loyalty. Life was very cheap in the Stormtrooper Corps.
Get up! We're almost there! Almost where? Where are we going? Just over that last ridge! Victory is...
Everything was really about the glory of the Empire, and everything was about obeying your commanding officer. The Stormtrooper Corps was not only the premier light infantry fighting force in the Galactic Empire, it was also an extremely political organization. A good deal of training involved political indoctrination and the tenets of the New Order, and a personal pledge and commitment to Emperor Palpatine himself. It also helped that Darth Vader oftentimes led the individual units of stormtroopers into battle from the front and earned both respect and fear from the men. As a matter of fact, some units, including Vader's own personal legion, probably worshipped him more than they did Palpatine. Now, if you take a look at how stormtroopers were deployed, you'll start to see almost a second parallel military force built alongside the more conventional Army and Navy, almost like a watchdog kind of organization. So we mentioned that the stormtroopers are light infantry. Well, that basically just means that they're able to deploy very quickly to many parts of the galaxy with minimal equipment. All they really needed was their blasters and a week's worth of supplies, and they were generally good. Stormtrooper units did have heavy weapon squads. They had drivers and vehicles, but for the most part, they depended on the other military branches for fire support and transportation. A stormtrooper was primarily a rifleman first, and a political officer second. They also had very limited support staff, unless they were deployed in a Legion-sized unit. But more often, especially in the earlier years of the war, Stormtrooper battalions were broken up into smaller platoons, and even squad-sized elements, and deployed alongside their Imperial Navy and Army brethren. Now, Stormtroopers on starships played a very important role. They were usually a part of the ground team. They helped carry out expeditions or assaults on enemy fortifications or settlements on the ground. They also escorted VIPs and diplomats on more political missions. The Stormtroopers also aided the naval troopers in pulling security on ships, and they also performed demanding and very dangerous boarding operations. While loyalty and discipline and morale were usually pretty good on Imperial vessels, the added presence of Stormtroopers and their zeal definitely made things feel a little safer, I guess, for Emperor Palpatine. Remember, the ISD was basically the pride of the Navy, and Palpatine wanted his own eyes on these vessels. When Stormtrooper units were deployed alongside Imperial Army units, they served more as vanguard units, usually deployed to the toughest parts in the line. They not only boosted morale, but they also kept everyone on their toes. Remember, Imperial Army troopers did not usually have the same indoctrination or motivation to fight. I consider most standard Imperial Army infantry units as just like garrison units. They were good behind fortifications, but if you needed them to maneuver on enemy positions, you needed additional training and motivation, especially from Stormtroopers from behind, usually with automatic weapons. And so the Stormtrooper Corps, at least in the first decade of the Empire's reign, were truly elite units that buffed any normal Imperial unit in the area and encouraged better outcomes wherever they went. They also kind of served like political commissars. Again, there was that zeal, their hatred for traitors and people not being loyal, hence the suicide bombing at POW collection points after the war was over. Kind of system that only someone as paranoid as Emperor Palpatine could ever create or put effort into developing. Because these Stormtroopers caused a lot of friction, between them and naval and army trooper units, as you would expect. They were just a bit too fanatic in their approach to combat, and they wanted everyone else to follow them. They were too willing to march headfirst into enemy fire for glory, rather than say, assess the situation, call for fire support, maybe maneuver in a more smarter way in smaller elements, or flank the enemy. I feel like at one point, if you weren't calling in mass wave attacks, a Stormtrooper officer would probably call you a traitor and try to execute you. It's not to say that Stormtroopers weren't tough fighters. They were. They just tended to be kind of stupid and wasteful in how they approached the battlefield. They always tried to overwhelm their enemies with their bodies. Which is what happens when you create a peacetime military force that has a lot of political indoctrination and also is trained not to really think for themselves. It's no wonder why many Stormtroopers would not give up even after the Emperor died and would carry on fighting an insurgency. It was basically a cult. And when you go too far down that rabbit hole, when you drink the Kool-Aid, it can be very hard to change your worldview to kind of snap out of it.
Look around you, man. Do you even recognize the Empire anymore?
Please don't do this.
The Empire's job is to save civilians from things like Operation Cinder.
This is the new Empire.
If this is the new Empire, I want no part of it. I'm taking the orders of my commanding officer.
Are these your orders? Are these your orders? Because if they are, this is treason. Are these your orders?
Now, I would argue that the effectiveness of the Imperial Army would gradually get worse the more paranoid that Emperor Palpatine got, starting with the Aldhani heist. Palpatine began diverting more resources to training more Stormtroopers, and by the time the Galactic Civil War started in earnest, you had almost more Stormtrooper units than Imperial Army units. Obviously, the quality of these troopers continued to degrade as Emperor Palpatine desperately tried to further increase the size of what really should have been just a small vanguard force. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. Also, check out our last video where we talk about TIE Fighter pilots and why they're crazy, or our video before that where we talk about what it takes to become a captain of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Also, a very crazy experience. Alright guys, I'll see you next time. My name is Alan, reminding you that
my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!